Good day. My programme yesterday was to a certain extent taken up with information news that was pouring in about the shooting down of an IL-76 transport aircraft carrying 60 Ukrainian soldiers to Belgorod, who were to be taken to the frontier and who were to be exchanged for Russian prisoners in Ukrainian custody. The Russians, as you will all remember, shortly after the shooting down of the IL-76, announced that it had been shot down by Ukraine and by Ukrainian missiles, and confirmed the death of these Ukrainian soldiers. The Russian Ministry of Defense, in fact, within a few hours, published a lengthy public statement setting out Moscow's account of what had happened. And I'll just read it. The Kiev regime carried out a terrorist act as a result of which an aircraft of the Russian military transport aviation on a flight from Chkalovsky to Belgorod airfield to transport Ukrainian servicemen for exchange was shot down. The armed forces of Ukraine struck the aircraft from Lipsky, a village in Kharkiv region, by a missile of an air defense system. The Russian Aerospace Forces radar detected a launch of 2 missiles. There were 6 crew members, 65 Ukrainian prisoners of war, on board the aircraft, which transported them for prisoners' exchange, and 3 Russian servicemen who accompanied the prisoners of war. As a result, the crew and all passengers were killed. The leadership of Ukraine was well aware that, in accordance with established practice, Ukrainian servicemen were to be transported by military transport aircraft to Belgorod airfield today for exchange. According to an earlier agreement, the event was to take place in the afternoon at Kolotylovka checkpoint on the Russian-Ukrainian border. Nevertheless, they use a description drawn from the 1930s. Kiev regime did that in an attempt to put blame on Russia for killing Ukrainian servicemen. By committing this terrorist act, the Ukrainian leadership showed its true face. It disregarded the lives of its citizens. So the Russian Ministry of Defense has said that the Ukrainians shot down the plane, by launching missiles from a village called Lipsy, that they were aware of they had information about the plane. This was part of a standard practice. An IL-76 would come from wherever the prisoner camps are in Russia, bring the prisoners to Belgorod, and they would be taken off the aircraft at Belgorod airfield, transported to the Ukrainian border, to a checkpoint on the Ukrainian border, where they would be exchanged for prisoners, Russian prisoners, in Ukrainian control. And the Russians say that this killing of these Ukrainian soldiers, this shooting down of the Russian aircraft, was intentional, that the Ukrainian authorities did it on purpose, which explains why the Russians call it a terrorist act. Well, it took many hours for the Ukrainians to respond, and it must be said immediately that they have, up to this time, failed to provide a full account. Firstly, we did start to get a number of confused reports from Ukrainian officials, which basically acknowledged that it was the Ukrainians who had shot down this aircraft, though they did it in a most elliptical way. They said that the air defense forces in Ukraine have the right and the mission to shoot down any threatening aircraft, any aircraft that they see, Russian aircraft that they see. There was no admission from Ukraine that there were Ukrainian prisoners in this aircraft. There has not been any such admission from Ukraine up to this time, in fact. And late in the evening, President Zelensky made a broadcast in which he said that this whole incident required international investigation and that the Russians were manipulating this incident for their own advantage, which of course, in the case of the second, is true. But why is that surprising or even wrong in a situation of conflict like the one we have now? But anyway, what to make of all of this? Well, I think that both the Ukrainian silence and these somewhat muddled admissions from Ukraine put the question about whether Ukraine shot this aircraft down truly beyond doubt. The early reports from Ukrainian sources boasting about the fact that an aircraft had been shot down came from informal, non-official Ukrainian sources. But the Ukrainians are not denying that they shot down the aircraft. They are sort of admitting that they did, and they clearly did shoot this aircraft down. And it's clear that there were Ukrainian prisoners of war on board. Now, Ukrainian officials have been going around briefing that they were not, in fact, informed by the Russians about the presence of this aircraft over Belgorod, that there was no written or verbal warnings from the Russians that this aircraft was on its way. I think that it's not actually a strong a point as it's made to seem. Now, the Russians, of course, do insist that they did provide the Ukrainians with all the information that they needed, but the Russians have anyway said that this is a routine event. Whenever there's a prisoner exchange, things always happen in this way. The Ukrainians could have spotted an aircraft, they would have known that prisoners of war were coming, and that should have meant that they took precautions, and they didn't. Well, anyway, that's the varying stories. As I said, the Ukrainians deny that they were tipped off by the Russians. The Russians insist they did tip off the Ukrainians. The Ukrainians, at any rate, definitely knew that a prisoner of war exchange was taking place. So I don't think this actually gives the Ukrainians any sort of defense. But did the Ukrainians deliberately shoot this aircraft down? Now here I'm going to say, I think that there is no evidence to speak of. One can come up with all kinds of theories about why the Ukrainians would have done that. I'm not going to explore these theories further in this program. I will say straightforwardly that I think much more likely the reason the aircraft was shot down was not because the Ukrainians wanted to shoot it down. It is because Ukraine has only a tenuous control of parts of its air defense system. And it's not difficult to understand this. Over the last couple of weeks, from what all the reports show, Ukraine has been shuttling air defense missiles from one part of the front line to another. Strana, the dissident Ukrainian newspaper, has been talking about this. And the purpose of carrying out this very complex and very difficult operation is to try to ambush Russian aircraft by launching long-range missiles against them from locations where the Russians don't expect those missiles to be. And I can remember that over the course of the summer, there was an incident where 4 Russian aircraft, from memory, they were 2 Sukhoi 34s and 2 helicopters, were all shot down in one place. There was a lot of speculation about that, how that was done. I think that it's probably now looking likely that this was a trial run for this tactic that the Ukrainians have of trying to shuttle around their missiles. So that happened in the summer. Then a few weeks ago, there were reports that the Ukrainians shot down first one Sukhoi 34 fighter bomber over Kherson region. Then the number went up to 5, and then it was reduced to 3. The Russians have never commented on this story, and as I said, in my opinion, the best evidence so far suggests that only one Sukhoi 34 was in fact shot down, and in fact the Russians, on that occasion, appear to have tracked down the Patriot missile battery, which was responsible, and destroyed it together with its operators as it was being loaded onto a train somewhere in Kherson region. And then about a week ago, there was another report that the Ukrainians had shot down, or claimed to have shot down, 2 Russian aircraft over the Sea of Azov, an Ilyushin 22M, electronic intelligence aircraft and command post, and a Beriev A-50 AWACS aircraft. Now, there is, I think, conclusive evidence that the Ilyushin 22 was indeed hit by shrapnel from what looks like an air defense missile, though that aircraft managed to land safely on a Russian airfield. As I have said many times, there is no independent evidence, no corroboration at all that a Beriev A-50 was shot down. The Ukrainians have never provided independent evidence confirming this, and there's been no pictures of debris or anything like that which would confirm the loss of that aircraft. Well, the reason I've recited all of these incidents is because we see that the Ukrainians have been in the habit, as I said, of moving about air defense systems. And the problem with doing that is that it must complicate command and control. And given how chaotic things are in Kiev at any one particular point in time, I think it is not at all difficult to imagine a situation where information about a prisoner exchange is not reaching missile controllers, who are probably moving around missiles, constantly worried about Russian airstrikes. The Russians are hunting these missiles all the time. The Ukrainian operators must be very nervous as they carry out these movements of these missiles. Moving missiles around must be an arduous and complicated operation in itself. And beyond that, one suspects that since concealment appears to be a large part of this exercise, communications between the missile operators and the authorities in Kiev are probably at a restricted level because of Ukrainian concerns that the Russians might detect the communications and might be able to trace them use them to trace where the Ukrainian missiles are. The Russians, by the way, have in the past admitted that they are able to intercept Ukrainian radio communications. So I think that's what happened. I think it is as simple as this. I think the Ukrainians lost track of their air defense missiles. The soldiers, the operators, are probably given a very high degree of autonomy in the way that they were able to operate. As a result, were not properly informed about what the purpose of this Ilyushin 76 was. They'd probably been deployed to the border near Belgorod because there's been these heavy Russian missile strikes on the big city of Kharkiv nearby, and the Ukrainians anyway might have been hoping to shoot down some Russian aircraft over Belgorod as some kind of counter to the Russian attacks on Kharkiv. And as I said, if you put this all together, the explanation of how this aircraft, this tragedy happened, actually presents itself, or at least so it seems to me. So I doubt it was intentional. What it was, of course, was massively embarrassing and probably politically very, very difficult for President Zelensky's government. Now, one consequence of this tragedy is that the Ukrainian parliament, the Rada, has had now again to postpone apparently voting on the new mobilization law. They appear to understand that in a situation where Ukrainian troops are being killed by Ukrainian missiles, passing a law like that is going to be even less popular than it already is. So that's, I think, one thing that's probably happened. I'm not saying this law isn't going to be revived and there won't be a vote on it at some point, but as I said, for the moment, it looks as if that law has been postponed. And of course, Zelensky, he can't really deny the fact that the aircraft was shot down by Ukrainian missiles. The evidence really is just too strong to be argued away. But we see the spinning operation going on. Ukraine wasn't kept properly informed, and there should be an independent investigation. Well, this is all I'm going to say about this incident up to now. I do wonder whether, in the light of what has happened, the Ukrainians will continue with this practice of trying to have air defense missile systems roaming around the Ukrainian countryside, getting dangerously close to the Russian front lines, launching missiles opportunistically against available targets at enormous risk to themselves. I think what this episode demonstrates is the enormous dangers of this kind of operation. If operators are launching missiles at aircraft that they haven't identified properly, it explains why tragedies like the one with the ETHEREUM have happened, and why major errors like the confusion between an ETHEREUM-22 and a Beriev A50 AWACS, which I suspect was what happened in that incident, why errors like that can occur. It also, by the way, explains why Ukraine does now seem to be losing a significant proportion of its air defense missile systems. Now, yesterday in their briefing, the Russian Defense Ministry mentioned that a Ukrainian, a French-supplied SAMP air defense missile system operating the Aster missiles, that this had been destroyed in Ukraine. Now, again, the Russian report, very uninformative in some ways. It mentions that this air defense system has been destroyed. It doesn't make it clear whether what is destroyed is a part or a whole of this air defense system. For the record, the Russian report specifically refers to a system, which suggests to me that an entire complex has been destroyed. And I'm reinforcing that view by mention of the fact that the radar of an S-300 system was also separately destroyed by the Russians, apparently on the same day, but in a separate incident. So the Russians one might think when they talk about a system, they mean the entire package, and that if, say, only a battery of launchers had been destroyed, the Russian Defense Ministry would have said as much. But then, of course, just to come back, distortion of information, misinformation, if you like, is an important part of war. Perhaps an entire system was destroyed, perhaps only a battery was destroyed. Who knows? Perhaps we shouldn't place too much reliance or overanalyze too far the information that the Russian Defense Ministry are providing us on these sort of matters. What does seem to be the case is that another part of Ukraine's air defense system has been destroyed as a result of Russian action. Anyway, as I said, this is all I'm going to say for the moment about the incident with the IL-76. For the moment, the reception of this news in Ukraine is one of grief and resignation rather than anger, at least so far as I can see. But of course, that might change. We'll just have to wait and see. Meanwhile, what about the news on the battlefronts? And here, again, the emphasis, the focus is on what is happening in Avdeyevka. This town, this heavy fortified position close to Donetsk city, town of 30,000 people before the war, the current iteration of the fighting began, a place from which the Ukrainians have shelled Donetsk city, a place which used to be apparently the center of the Ukrainian forces close to Donetsk city, and by nearly every account, at least up to this point, the key to the defense system in this part of Donetsk, the Ukrainian defense system, and also, of course, in the vivid words of a Western journalist, a dagger at the heart of Donetsk. In other words, the launch point of any Ukrainian offensive on Donetsk city, had such an offensive at any point ever taken shape. So, what about what is going on in Avdeyevka? Well, we've heard over the last couple of days about this enormous Russian advance in the southern part of Avdeyevka, how the Russians have been able to capture much of the south of Avdeyevka. The result is that two major Ukrainian defense positions at an air defense base set to the south of Avdeyevka and in this place called the Tsar's hunting lodge, that these defense positions have now collapsed. And there's been many reports that the Russians have entrenched themselves now in this area of southern Avdeyevka. Well, there have been further reports over the last 24 hours, which give us a rather vivid idea of what has happened. First of all, we've now seen, or at least we've now had provided, photographs of this famous pipe that the Russians used to move from the industrial area that they captured a few weeks ago deep behind Ukrainian lines in southern Avdeyevka, the use of which is supposed to have been decisive in this operation. Now, I've seen these pictures of this pipe, and let me repeat again that I am not the best person to analyze photographs. I do not have good vision, and photographs, especially on laptops and even more widescreen computers, are especially difficult for me to read. But this pipe, which looks to me actually to be some kind of drain, it is hardly a tunnel. Pipe describes it accurately. I would have thought that only one man could move along this pipe at a time. It is, as I said, quite narrow and tight. The idea that soldiers could advance along this pipe in very large numbers, I can't personally believe. And beyond that, it is all but inconceivable that these soldiers, or so it seems to me, could have been carrying much in the way of heavy equipment. They would be able to advance with basically whatever they could carry, and they would have to be very fit, extremely well-trained men to be able to do even that, especially given the distance that they would have had to travel through this pipe, which I understand is something like 2 kilometers. And apparently there was problems with oxygen supply, and the Russians had to find ways of keeping this pipe supplied with oxygen, and the pipe was had to be emptied of the refuge that had clogged it up, and apparently at one point there was a seepage of water into the pipe, which then froze and also made it unusable. So this is a very complex, very difficult operation using this pipe, and only a small number of men can be involved, and by definition, I'm guessing, these would have had to be elite special forces soldiers. And moving further, I find it very difficult to believe that the number of soldiers who exited through this pipe behind Ukrainian lines, apparently 150 in total, could have won this battle all by themselves. Clearly, what happened is that this was a very complex operation carried out by the Russians. There's some reports which I read on Radovka, this Russian site, news media site published in Smolensk region, which keeps fairly up to date with the progress of the war. Anyway, there they were claiming that this whole operation to capture southern Avdeyevka was planned over the course of a whole year. Now, if that's right, then remember a year ago, in January 2023, the Russians were nowhere close to advancing on Avdeyevka itself. At that time, they were busy building their fortifications ahead of Ukraine's summer offensive and laying siege to Bakhmut, which was an incredibly difficult battle, which was only completed in May. So if the Russians were indeed planning this operation from as far back as this time last year, then, well, all I will say is they must have been engaging in a great deal of forward planning indeed, expecting to capture Bakhmut and defeat the Ukrainian counteroffensive, and then going on the attack themselves in Avdeyevka later in the autumn. I'm not saying that kind of planning is impossible, but, well, anyway, if it did happen, it really does show a very high degree of forward thinking and advanced preparations by the Russians indeed. And of course, we still have the unanswered question of why the Ukrainians never detected this pipe and why the Russians knew about this pipe. Apparently, again, if we believe Radovka, months before they captured the industrial sector of Avdeyevka and found the pipe still in existence and capable of being unblocked and used in the way that it was. So, if you're getting, from me, a certain sense of skepticism about this Russian story, I mean, you would be right to. There is no doubt this pipe exists. There is no doubt that the Russians used it. There is no doubt that it did catch the Ukrainians completely by surprise. The fact that there were Russian troops at their rear seems to have shocked the Ukrainian defenders. But definitely, this was only a part of a much more complex operation devised by the Russians, and by the way, a fairly risky one, and carried out at whirlwind speed and with complete success. A high degree of luck probably played a role, and I would add, by the way, on that front, that there must have been some element of luck in finding this pipe still intact and in finding that the Ukrainians either had failed to detect it or had failed to understand its significance despite being 8 years in occupation. Anyway, there we go. I mean, I'm not going to try to reconstruct this story and this battle further. We will no doubt be getting an awful lot more information in due course, especially once the war is over. All kinds of people will be writing their memoirs, and we will gradually learn a lot more about the use of this pipe. The key point to make is that the Russians control this large area in the south of Avdeyevka, and it does seem as if Ukrainian soldiers were cut off in various places, and over the course of today, pictures have started to appear of large numbers of Ukrainian prisoners being taken by the Russians. And there are reports, rumors now, that the 110th Brigade, to which most of these soldiers belong, and which form the core of the Ukrainian Defense Forces in Avdeyevka, has lost its operational capabilities, that its attempt to drive the Russians back out of southern Avdeyevka, having gone disastrously wrong, have caused it to suffer exceptional losses, so that the brigade is no longer a coherent and battle-worthy force. Well, as to whether that is true, we shall see. Virtually all reports, Russian and Ukrainian, now concede that if the Russians are now prepared to press forward, at some point over the next few days or weeks, before the Ukrainians can regain their balance, they will be able to roll up the whole of Avdeyevka in a relatively short space of time. Now, I'm going to just finish by making one further observation about this particular extraordinary incident, which is that, of course, if the Russians were planning this whole operation months in advance, as we're now being led to believe, well, then that, to my mind, all but confirms that the fighting in Stepovoye and along the railway was more of a pinning operation than anything else, preventing Ukrainian reinforcements from being redeployed south to Avdeyevka itself, obliging the Ukrainians to keep most of their forces northwest of Avdeyevka and allowing the Russians to clear up Avdeyevka itself. That, at least, is how I would assess this news. Now, what about other places around the battlefronts? And again, because of this huge emphasis on the fighting in Avdeyevka, the oxygen of publicity has been to a great extent drained away from the other fronts. We know far less about what is going on the other front lines. This is, by the way, again, the contrast with the practice of the Russian Ministry of Defense. I read once again this morning their latest their latest military bulletin, the daily military bulletin, and once again, the Russian Defense Ministry omits all references to the Battle of Avdeyevka, doesn't even mention this place by name. It gives no estimate of Ukrainian losses. in this battle. It doesn't even mention the fact that the Russian military has achieved this extraordinary successful blow in the south of Avdeyevka and now controls a significant part of this town and might be poised to capture the rest of it. So the Russian Ministry of Defense completely silent about Avdeyevka, everybody else talking inordinately about Avdeyevka and largely ignoring what is going on in other places. And since I depend on others to provide the news, the various Telegram channels, the military summary channel, the various mappers, Syriac and all the others, I cannot make up for this lack of information. I do get the sense that the Russians have once again intensified their attacks on the Krinky bridgehead, or rather what is left of the Krinky bridgehead. Maybe they've decided that enough's enough and the time has now finally come to clean this bridgehead up once and for all. There's also reports that the Russians have made further advances in the Liman and Bakhmut area and to the west of Marinka, but it's very difficult to get detailed information because all the focus, all the interest is on Avdeyevka. At the time of the siege of Bakhmut, this time last year, I remember encountering the same phenomenon. Even as the Russians were building enormous fortified lines and preparing their first attack on Avdeyevka, which took place in March of 2023, resulting, by the way, in the capture of the village of Krasnogorovka to the north of Avdeyevka. All the interest, all the focus was on Bakhmut and on the outsized personality, which was Yevgeny Prigozhin. So, anyway, that's the situation on the battlefronts. But lots of comments about the general situation. We've had information from Business Insider, information from the Estonian Defense Minister, all of them conceding that the Russians now outgun Ukraine, the Ukrainian forces, to an extraordinary degree, that the Russian military has no shortage of ammunition, whereas the Ukrainians are desperately short of ammunition, and the ammunition shortages are getting greater and greater. The Estonian Defense Minister has come forward and has admitted that the West hugely underestimated, or at least, I don't know what she said hugely, but underestimated Russia's capacity to increase military equipment and ammunition production. I find that, by the way, astonishing. Estonia was, after all, for about 40 years, incorporated within the Soviet Union. I would have thought that within that time frame, Estonians ought to have become pretty familiar with the way in which the Russian industrial system works. I find it surprising that the Estonian defense minister, of all people, should be surprised by Russian industrial capacities. But there we are. The minister admits that Estonia was, and so was the entirety of the West. And across the West, we see increasing signs of panic, and perhaps the most extreme example of this has come from my own country, Britain, where the head of the British Army has now made a speech. I should say the outgoing head of the British Army has made an astonishing speech, saying that Britain could be at war with Russia very soon, and that the British Army is completely incapable of withstanding the Russian army. This is an astonishing reversal from the kind of things that were being said at the height of Ukraine optimism at the end of 2022, early 2023. But anyway, the British military would be incapable of withstanding the Russian military, and strongly hinting at the need to reintroduce conscription and to remilitarize the outlook of British youth. Now, the last, I should say, is a hopeless endeavour. Any suggestion of reintroducing conscription in Britain would meet an immensely strong and very negative reaction from the British public. The Sunak government is in no position to implement such a policy ahead of an election which it is already certain to lose, and lose disastrously. And if it took such a step, I strongly suspect that the succeeding Starmer government, knowing how unpopular it was, would find itself obliged to reverse it. So it isn't going to happen, and the British government, 10 Downing Street, the Prime Minister's office, almost as soon as these statements from this general started to circulate, they rushed out a statement saying that there are no plans to reintroduce conscription, which, by the way, ended in Britain in, I believe, 1960. And I'm sure that is correct. So, there we go. Why did he say that? Well, as I said, it is a symptom of the general panic that is now widespread across Europe. Similar things have been said by the German Defense Minister, Boris Pistorius. There have been similar hints in Germany that Germany should also reintroduce conscription. In Germany, conscription was ended only a few years ago, so it's a more familiar concept than it is in Britain. But still, I suspect that would be a deeply unpopular measure. Anyway, there's panic in Germany, there's panic in the Baltic states. I've discussed this before. There's panic now in Britain because the universal expectation that the Russians would be defeated in the summer of 2023 once Ukraine launched its great summer counteroffensive have been shattered, and officials and military people across the West, across Europe especially, are becoming seriously alarmed that the proxy war against Russia has not weakened Russia in the way that they imagined it would, but instead it has conjured into existence a Russian military juggernaut, which the Europeans, left to themselves, are in no position to stop. And the other thing that is causing the Europeans to become increasingly nervous is the continued rise in the United States of Donald Trump. Now, the Europeans appear to have persuaded themselves that Donald Trump is somehow hostile to NATO, that if he were to be re-elected president, the United States might start to abandon Europe to its fate, might even opt out of NATO entirely. The Europeans are perfectly well aware of their massive military inadequacies, the complete mismatch between their military power and that of Russia. And as I said, this is making them anxious and nervous as well, and is provoking all of these new ideas and theories about the fact that Europe needs to build up its defense capabilities, reintroduce conscription, start a new war economy, do all of those things, because the Russian bear is on the prowl, and the Americans are going away. Now, I have a few things to say about this. The first thing I want to say is that, very fortunately for the Europeans, the Russians have no plans to march on Europe. There has been a, well, reasonably good article by Mark Galeotti on this precise topic. He says many things in it, not all of which I agree with. Mark Galeotti, by the way, being a strong critic of Vladimir Putin and somebody who, at the start of the Ukraine war, was as hardline as anyone in the West against Russia. But anyway, he's significantly moderated his views. And he's come out and said very simply that for the Russians, control of Ukraine, or at least Ukraine, not perhaps control of Ukraine, but feelings about Ukraine and Belarus are extremely strong. The Russians, Putin himself, have never shown the slightest interest or desire to march further west, to march deeper into Europe. This is simply not on anybody's agenda in Moscow. And basically, I agree with that. But let's just take a step back and think this through a little. If there is now a Russian military juggernaut trundling into sight, if the West is about to lose badly in Ukraine, and by the way, there's now more and more rumors that sometime in the summer, the Russians calculate that Ukrainian forces will have been so weakened that the moment will have come for them to launch their big advance in Ukraine, finally causing the Ukrainian military to collapse and causing the present Ukrainian government to fall and perhaps retreat to Lviv, or perhaps even to the west, but we'll see. But as I said, if this Russian military juggernaut now exists, which the West never suspected, then doesn't that once again call into doubt the wisdom of Western policy, especially European policy, towards Russia leading up to the war? These endless provocations and actions against the Russians, which the Russians would inevitably perceive as hostile. The violation of the promise of that the NATO would not be extended eastward, the scrapping of the various arms control treaties, the subversion of the Minsk agreement, and indeed of every other single agreement that the West made with the Russians on the issue of Ukraine. The open support for opponents of President Putin and his government in Moscow, within Russia itself, the attempts to interfere in Russian economic policy through, for example, the introduction of the third energy package, which, if taken to its logical conclusion, would have required the breakup of the two Russian state monopolies covering the gas and oil sectors, Gazprom and Rosneft. Well, doesn't it now all seem as if all that has achieved, including all the insistence on Ukraine's right to join NATO, that all that this has actually done is provoke the Russians and conjure into existence this Russian military juggernaut, which the Europeans are in no position, as they appear to realize, to withstand. And if the Europeans come forward and say, well, they were relying on the Americans to protect them, even as they were doing all of these extraordinary things, is this not piling on more folly upon folly, provoking an enemy, potentially in military terms at least, more powerful than yourself, in reliance upon another country a whole ocean away? An earlier generation of European leaders, Willy Brandt, Helmut Schmidt in Germany, Gerhard Schröder in Germany also, Charles de Gaulle, Valéry Giscard d'Estaing, François Mitterrand, Harold Wilson, Margaret Thatcher, they would never have let themselves be drawn into a trap like this. They would have understood immediately that given the deep sentiments and connections and importance of Ukraine to Russia, it was a place where the West needed to tread very carefully indeed, and that the overriding priority was not to provoke the Russians, but to take steps that would preserve peace in Europe. Anyway, just saying all of this because, as I said, panic is in the air and much sudden talk about the Russians marching on Berlin and Paris and London and occupying the whole of Europe, and talk about why we need to militarize our societies and transform our militaries and reintroduce conscription and do all of these things in order to avert a threat which, in my opinion, does not exist, and which do not, to the extent that it does exist, we have ourselves created. Anyway, that is the first thing. The second is that I see that there is now an increasing concerted effort on the part of some people to try to get away from the reality of the straightforward reality that in April 2022, there was a potential peace ending the conflict in Ukraine. There have been at least 3 articles in National Interest, all of which try to argue that no peace agreement was in prospect and that the idea that peace was possible in April 2022 is a myth. And I should say I'm grateful to Jeff Roberts for the links he's provided to the 2 latest articles, which appeared, by the way, on the 17th of January and on the 23rd of January. I have to say that this stream of articles that has been appearing in National Interest on this topic suggests that someone in the editorial board of the National Interest is becoming obsessive around this topic. But there's been similar articles appearing, I believe, in The Spectator and in other places, all of which are trying to cast doubt on the fact that we were very close to an agreement in April 2022. And again, it's not difficult to understand why, because if there had been a chance for peace in April 2022, and if that chance for peace was indeed thrown away, and the consequence is indeed a catastrophic military defeat for the West in Ukraine, and if it is indeed the case that as a result of that defeat, the Western powers now face a Russian military juggernaut on their doorstep, which had never existed before, how much better would it have been if that peace agreement that had been almost completed in April 2022 had been supported and had been brought into existence, had actually resulted in a genuine peace? So, of course, you have to deny that there was, in fact, a peace that you have to say, well, the reason there wasn't a peace was because there were all kinds of problems with this agreement. It hadn't been properly worked out. All sorts of things still needed to be sorted out. And this idea that the peace was lost, well, it's a myth. Now, I am going to say a few things about these articles in the national interest. The first is that they engage in some pretty astonishing omissions. The first omission is that they barely touch on the situation in Donbass at all. Now, they talk a great deal about NATO, the fact that the Russians were very keen to prevent Ukraine joining NATO, but they accept that this was certainly one of the factors that caused the Russians to take the decisions that they did in February 2022, but they leave out the other side of the story, which was what had been happening in Donbass. And the latest article makes the point that Ukraine had been offered NATO membership in 2008, and there is no move had been made to bring Ukraine into NATO thereafter, and why therefore should the Russians worry that Ukraine would join NATO in 2022? Well, as I said, there were general reasons why the Russians might have been worried that NATO membership for Ukraine was not that far distant. But alongside NATO membership, there is also the fact that the conflict in the Donbass had gone unresolved. And I noticed that these articles, for example, skate over, or in the case of the second one, the one on the 23rd of January, appear entirely to ignore the whole vexed history of the Minsk agreements. Minsk I and Minsk II, signed by Ukraine, ignored by Ukraine, the Western powers continuing to impose sanctions on Russia, saying that Russia was violating the Minsk agreements, even though they knew that it was Ukraine that was actually refusing to implement the Minsk agreements, things that Merkel and Hollande have, to all intents and purposes, acknowledged. And further concerns on the part of the Russians that over the last number of years, Ukraine was being systematically rearmed. And I've been getting more and more information about this. And I've seen one report, by the way, at least one message has been sent to me, which I can't corroborate, but which suggests the Javelin missiles were already being delivered to Ukraine whilst Barack Obama was still president, despite the formal position that the US government had at that time taken, which was that they would not arm Ukraine. But there was something that has been said, which I generally find astonishing, and this is in the second article, which, by the way, just to correct, was agreed on was written on the 24th of January, not the 23rd. But the article actually makes a very remarkable claim, which is that, sorry, it was the article written on the 17th of January, which is that, well, I read what it says. Keeping Ukraine out of NATO was doubtless central for Putin, but the Ukrainians had their own agenda. It included finalizing Crimea's status in negotiations over 15 years, a provision they included in the Istanbul communique, but that Putin flatly rejected. Well, I don't understand how they can say that he actually rejected it, because his foreign minister, Sergei Lavrov, has now given an interview to CBS, which says something completely different. He says, we did not reject the Ukrainian peace plan because the plan was initialed by both Russians and Ukrainians in April 2022 and was proposed by the Ukrainian delegation. Roughly, it was no NATO, no military blocs, no military bases on Ukrainian soil, no military games on Ukrainian soil, unless all guarantee countries agreed. All these guarantee countries included the P5, China, Turkey, Germany, and the list was open to anybody who would like to join the club. And the main thing was that the Ukrainians themselves stated in that paper that these guarantees would not cover Crimea and the east of Ukraine, and that the two countries would continue discussing whatever issues might be related to this kind of deal. So Putin did not reject the plan because the Ukrainians refused to give up their claims on Crimea. He was prepared to discuss Ukrainian claims to Crimea. He did tell the Italian Prime Minister, Mario Draghi, the following day that Russia would never give up Crimea, but that was never the topic of the discussion in this agreement. The agreement said that the guarantees would not cover Donbass and Crimea, and Ukraine and Russia would have 15 years to discuss this issue between themselves. And that was all that was proposed by Ukraine, and it was what Putin agreed to. So, again, I don't understand where people are looking for this Russian rejection of this agreement. Now, I'm going to add something further, which is that I remember reading very closely the British media at the time. I remember reading the Financial Times. I remember the Financial Times discussing the terms of the Istanbul Agreement with Ukrainian officials at the time and reporting on all of these terms exactly as described by Lavrov. That is all there in the Financial Times at that time. And on the vexed issue of Boris Johnson's interventions in Ukraine, again, there is a tendency to focus on what Johnson did or said over the course of his trip to Kiev and to ignore his telephone call to Zelensky from 10 days before, a telephone call reported by the London Times, in which Johnson also told Zelensky that the West and Britain were opposed to the plan as it was being drawn up. So again, I find it remarkable that this attempt to rewrite the story of the Istanbul Agreement is being made. But what it shows, again, is the great nervousness of the Western powers now that they face this debacle in Ukraine and are nervous about the outcome. They don't want to turn around and admit to their publics, who might question demands, the kind of scaremongering that's going on at the present time. They don't want to admit to their public that in April 2022, a honourable peace was within reach and was thrown away. Now, there's been another point, one final point I'm going to make about all of this, because again, if we go back to the national interest articles, if we go back to the articles that were appearing at the time, one thing immediately stands out, which is that even as Ukraine was negotiating with the Russians in Belarus and Turkey, it was getting almost no backing from the West, as it sought to pursue those negotiations. Putin immediately agreed to negotiations with the Ukrainians the moment they offered them. On the second day of the special military operation, he announced a one-day unilateral ceasefire to now allow Ukrainian delegates to arrive in Belarus. They failed to turn up, by the way. The Western powers never said anything. They never made it clear to the Ukrainians that they were supporting the Ukrainians in what they were doing in negotiating with the Russians. Throughout the whole period of the March and April discussions, they were extremely critical and negative, not just to the Russians, but towards the Russians, but towards the entire process of negotiation that was underway. On the contrary, President Biden was coming along at that time, as I well remember, and making speeches in Poland in which he was openly advocating regime change in Moscow. So, again, rewriting this story is a pointless exercise, but it points to, as I said, the ultimate failure of Western policy and the nervousness in Europe especially that it is causing. And it is also the case that we now have an accumulating amount of information about how stressed and nervous European governments are now increasingly becoming, and the extraordinary lengths to which they have overcommitted themselves in this conflict in Ukraine. I've done several programs now about the attack on the French so-called mercenaries in that hotel building in Kharkiv a couple of days ago. The first thing I should say is that I've heard from the source who provided me with the information that these troops, these men who were in that building, these French soldiers who were in that building, who provided me with the information that they were members of the Foreign Legion. Anyway, that source has informed me that Larry Johnson, the member of Veterans Intelligence Professionals for Sanity, and who has also said on YouTube that to his knowledge these were members of the French Foreign Legion. Anyway, this source has told me that he has not been in contact with Larry Johnson. So Larry Johnson has not obtained this information either from him or from the other sources that this person is in touch with. So it looks as if Larry Johnson obtained this information from a completely different source, and it appears to me that that confirms this information as true. They were indeed French foreign legionaries who were in that hotel building in Kharkiv, and the reports that they were caught, that they were found out by the Russians carrying out operations behind Russian lines, some within Russia itself, well, that appears to be true also. So, in other words, France was party to sending armed men across Russia's borders into Russia, something which has universally been recognized as an act of war. No wonder the Russians are furious and the French are so embarrassed. Anyway, there we are. This is where we are today in this conflict. The Russians in very strong position now in Avdeyevka. Ukrainian counterattacks in the south of Avdeyevka appear to have been unsuccessful. Ukraine severely embarrassed by this episode, this tragedy with the ETHEREUM-76, and the Western powers scrambling. The British talking about reintroducing conscription. Some people in the United States anxious to distance the Western powers from the collapse of the Istanbul Agreement in April 2022, even though their arguments, as I've said already, are completely unconvincing. I apologise, by the way, if I've taken a rather long time on that last issue, but I think it's one where, as I said, it is important to keep the record clear and not to let people think that there is more uncertainty about this matter than there really is. What will happen next? Well, clearly there's not going to be any negotiations. As I've said in recent programs, obviously there was a discussion in the West about what to do, especially in the United States. The hardliners appear to have won. Ideas of a freeze of the conflict and all of that, that's basically been abandoned. The Russians aren't interested. The Ukrainians are hostile. So even though everybody can see that the writing is on the wall, there's been articles, as I said, in Business Insider about this. There's a long article in Le Figaro, the French newspaper, about all of this. Despite all of that, we cannot have negotiations with the Russians. Instead, the plan seems to be to gradually keep the battle going. If Ukraine's fortified lines don't hold, and it's difficult to see how they can, or how they can even be constructed, well, eventually we look to leverage Kirill Budanov into the position of military command, relocate the entire government to Lviv in western Ukraine, and try to incite an insurgency against the Russians in the rest of Ukraine. That seems to be the plan to which the Western governments are now moving. Well, I've already made my own view about the plan, the unworkability of that plan, crystal clear. By the way, on the question of Zelensky and Budanov, Zelensky called a meeting of his top military chiefs to discuss the shooting down of the IL76. Both Zelensky and Budanov attended in their existing posts. So Zelensky is still overall military commander. So is Budanov. He's still head of military intelligence. But I did find it interesting that Budanov specifically would be invited to a meeting of this kind. I'm not quite sure what precise role he has, and I remain convinced, by the way, that the agenda to replace Zelensky, perhaps with Budanov, is still live. Stephen Bryan at the Asian Times has now written a really very good piece about this whole intrigue, which I would strongly recommend if people want to follow up on it. I'm now going to discuss the situation in the Middle East, because again, this has been a story of great confusion. Over the last couple of hours, rumors have started to circulate that the United States is planning a withdrawal of its forces from Syria and Iraq. Supposedly, the US and Iraqi governments are in contact and are in discussion about this, and there's also discussion within the Pentagon about how to carry out a withdrawal from Syria. Now, the moment this news appeared, all the usual people, Charles Lister, other neocons, deeply committed to the Syria project, the project to overthrow Bashar al-Assad. Anyway, they all rushed out, they started making tweets. They were incredibly upset and angry about those reports. They were also apparently upset by reports that some US officials are telling the US's Syrian Kurdish allies that with the United States withdrawing, they needed to make peace with the government of Bashar al-Assad and unite with Assad to fight ISIS. Anyway, as always happens, whenever these outcries, these orchestrated outcries from the neocons start, the officials in Washington become nervous, and the Pentagon rushed out a statement basically denying the story that the United States is considering a withdrawal from Syria. Now, I don't know what exactly is going on here, but I'm going to suggest that if the United States is indeed planning, or if there are indeed discussions about withdrawing troops from Syria and Iraq, then it might not be the positive sign of de-escalation that people think it is. The events of the last 2 weeks have once again demonstrated Iran's capability to strike at these isolated American bases, which are surrounded by what is in effect hostile terrain. The Iranians have launched missile strikes on bases in Erbil, and someone, almost certainly working alongside the Iranians, also launched ballistic missile strikes against the Ain al-Assad base in Iraq. Now, when the United States withdrew its forces from Afghanistan back in 2021, there was a huge amount of confusion and no real explanation as to why it had been done. There'd been an agreement by the previous president, Donald Trump, to withdraw from Afghanistan, but the Biden administration, the incoming Biden administration, had seemed minded during the election campaign to reverse that policy. But suddenly, the decision was made to press forward with the withdrawal, and it was conducted in what most people acknowledge was a somewhat chaotic way. Well, what most people perhaps are not aware of is that some months ago, the US Secretary of State, Tony Blinken, blurted out that one of the reasons why the United States withdrew its forces from Afghanistan in 2021 was because they were being taken out of harm's way in case of a confrontation between the US and Russia, and to prevent possible Russian retaliation against those US troops in Afghanistan. And, of course, the confrontation between the US and Russia duly took place. It began in February 2022 with the start of the special military operation. But by that point, of course, there were no US troops in Afghanistan for the Russians to retaliate against. Not that I'm saying, by the way, that the Russians would necessarily have retaliated against those US troops. But anyway, that was at least part of the rationale, or so it seems to me, for withdrawing the troops from Afghanistan. Now, could it be that we're seeing the same with these withdrawals, or discussed or spoken about withdrawals from the Middle East? That the American troops in Iraq and Syria are being taken out of harm's way because of growing alarm about the deterioration of the situation in the Middle East, but also specifically because plans to launch strikes directly against Iran are now ripening. And the United States does not want to leave troops in the area where they might be vulnerable to retaliation. Well, perhaps. I hope that is not the case. I hope that this is an actual move towards de-escalation, towards a US retreat from the Middle East. Something which would be good for the United States, good for the Middle East, and which might, in the end, facilitate a real resolution of the Palestine-Israel conflict. But I have to say, based on previous history, I fear the opposite. I fear that far from being a good sign, this could potentially turn out to be a bad sign, and we might start to see an escalation of the situation in the Middle East. Well, anyway, there we go. That we'll see what happens. We'll see how this plays out, whether those troops have been taken out of harm's way because the United States has decided that there's no benefit to them staying there and that the United States should begin to disengage from the Middle East, or whether the United States is taking them out of there because, on the contrary, officials in Washington have now decided that the time has come to redouble operations in the Middle East. As I said, we will find out soon enough, I suspect. But in the meantime, this is where I'm going to end this video. In my next video, I do want to return to the topic of the political situation in Germany, which is becoming very interesting. There have been two new parties formed in Germany. One, Sarah Wagenknecht's left-wing party, has attracted a great deal of attention in the international media. The other one, a conservative party, led by, I believe his name is Dr. Maaßen, a former judge, I believe, on Germany's constitutional court, and a well-respected man. Well, that has attracted a great deal less attention. And it looks as if the debate in the Bundestag on the question of the supply of the Taurus missiles was rather more complicated than I had realized, even though actually I think that overall it still amounts to the same thing. Germany is now most unlikely to supply Ukraine with Taurus missiles. But anyway, I will return to this topic in my next program. In the meantime, this is where I finish. It is, again, the point to say that you can find all our programs on our various platforms, Locals, Rumble, and X. You can also support our work via Patreon and Subscribestar. Don't forget also to go to our shop and check out the amazing things that you will find there. And last but not least, if you've liked this video, please remember to tick the like button and to check your subscription to this channel. That's me for today. More from me soon. Have a very good day.